previously incarcerated or on the verge of being incarcerated. So I did a lot more of my prison stuff with juveniles, not with adults. But I think we're rather done with adults.
After I was done in the prison, I once worked with a patient that was on their way to the joint that was addicted to controlled substances, and I worked with them too. Scary place to work.
Yeah.
I just have to say, Bob, I'm so sorry. Hearing you say on their way to the joint was probably my highlight of the day.
Well,
on their way to the big house.
That's how she talked about it.
Did you say joint?
I line up with my patients just because they've done something that society doesn't approve of doesn't mean that they still don't deserve the best pharmaceutical care I can provide them. If anything, when they're locked up, they deserve everything I can do because they can't get down the street if they don't like it. But anyhow, what was it like?
With the juveniles?
Yeah.
Well, imagine like normal teenagers, as delightful as they are, but like double that. And so we had a lot of addiction issues, a lot of behavior issues. They don't trust anybody because when being in the system, a lot of them not only worked with like juvenile court, but had DHS experience. So home life wasn't great. So getting them to trust was pretty difficult. Like, because they're like, okay, here's another person that's going to come fix me who doesn't really care about me. And then they're just going to leave. And so, and I mean, we'll talk about today how females and males act differently, like in corrections. And so it definitely, I was able to connect a lot with those on my caseload because of how I talk to them. Like I put it all on them where it was like, hey, like it's your choice to do whatever, because that's what teenagers want. They want to be able to make their own choices. And between the ages of like 15 and 18, it's really hard because they think that they know everything, but they're not able to make their own choices because they're still minors, but they can still make some choices. And so letting them make the choices that they could and putting it on them and making, like giving them responsibility, they responded really well to that. I found.
Well, I have a master's degree in psychology and human behavior modification. But what you're doing with sociology is really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, especially for me, like in the last 2 years, definitely last year for sure, like how society responds to things like the pandemic, like Black Lives Matter. It's been like the question of, you know, what are you willing to do for other people has definitely been tested in society. And so to be someone who studies society, like with the big picture, and especially someone who's interested in criminal justice with all that's gone on, it's been a wild ride, to say the least.
I bet.
Because I think I had told you guys before that I was interested in studying like women in the police force, but they didn't want to talk to anybody outside of the police force because they were concerned. And I mean, I have my roommate from college, her sister-in-law, who I've always been really close with, is a police officer. And she was like, I legally have been advised not to talk to you, not to talk to anybody. So even though with my research in academia, like I can't tell anybody, I can't disclose sources. I would have to be subpoenaed. And I mean, I would be willing to go to jail to protect my sources. Unless I got like some, I don't know, written something or other. But they were still scared, even with all that protection, to talk because of what could be said and how it could be misconstrued. And I completely understood because I started that work last May. And so June, it kind of blew up and was like, you know what, I'll step back from looking at the police department that closely because it was a pretty stressful time. And so, but I was working on a study looking at how they responded. I can't tell you what city specifically, but a fairly large Midwestern town. I interviewed a few women on how their departments handled Black Lives Matter. like the protests that were happening, different policies that were happening. And it was really interesting because I was expecting more men to participate, but really like a lot of the volunteers that I got were women from varying areas. Like one of the women was on maternity leave and pregnant. Another one was in charge of zoning and setting up any protests that were going to happen. So she was in contact with a lot of anti-establishment groups that were going to be involved in these protests. So it was really interesting to see how both of them like were on different sides and how things changed during that.
Wow.
But unfortunately, that kind of got stopped there for a bit after things picked up. But definitely interesting. And so, okay, so today we're going to be talking, let me share my little screen here. We'll be talking about women in crime in law enforcement. So in law enforcement and the justice system. If I say juvenile justice system, that's just because I'm programmed. I really mean like all of the justice system. And so a quick recap from last couple of weeks. So feminist theory looks at how women are impacted differently through society by applying. Yeah.
So sorry. Just FYI, you are in presenter mode. Are you cool with that?
Is there a way to make it so?
Yeah. So like go back in the way you were.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. So
do I just click play from start, right? Yep. Are you on? Can you see anything? Can you see my screen? Am I sharing?
No, you stopped sharing. So if you want to share again.
Yes.
Okay. And then play from start. Okay. And then swap displays. There we go. We're good.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. When I have an extra computer screen, it can get a little tricky. Okay. So yeah, not that I have anything in presenter view that you guys can't see. It just makes it easier if the slides are bigger for you. So looking at things from the female perspective is called feminist theory. And when we're applying it to criminology, we look at the different experiences women have through the legal system, including crimes that are committed, what they're victims of, and their differing experience within law enforcement. So first week, we went over crimes that women commit typically. Last week, we went over victimization. And then this week, we're looking at that, what it's like to be a woman in law enforcement. So women who commit crimes have historically been seen as more masculine, and women who are the victims of crime are seen as weak and delicate. So society has put women in these boxes, unfortunately, on what it is to be feminine, or what it is to be womanly. And so typically what falls within that is that weak, delicate, need to be taken care of. That's like the historical viewpoint that we've had of this. Thankfully, in more modern times, we're steering away from those generalizations, but they still kind of control different parts of our life. So the opposite viewpoints that they have of the person who's the criminal and the person who's the victim, it's seen as a way for society to attempt to control the behavior of women. So don't be so weak that you're a victim, but don't be so strong that you're an offender, right? Like how to be a woman in society is to stay in the middle, like stay safe, but don't be too harsh or you'll be seen as masculine. It's being a woman is fun, right? So when it comes to victimization, women are often the victims of domestic abuse or sexual assault crimes, and that those crimes are less likely to lead to arrest or conviction compared to other crimes. Okay. Oops. Okay, so some history of law enforcement here. There we go. So when I say law enforcement, I'm talking about policing, corrections, and like probation and parole. So there is a little bit of a controversy on who is the first female police officer. So the first three main ones that are listed are Marie Owens, Lola Baldwin, and Alice Stebbins Wells. So Marie Owens was with the Chicago Police Department in 1891. She is often seen as like the very first one, but these first two aren't necessarily, they're like second thoughts when it comes to like the first woman police officer. Lola Baldwin was with the Portland Police Department in 1908, and Alice Stebbins Wells was with the Los Angeles Police Department in 1910. She's the one, if you were to look up who the first female police officer is, Alice Stebbins Wells would be that one. There's a lot of information on her because her outreach was huge. So her philosophy was around the idea of prevention rather than arrest or treatment after the fact. So in her mind, working with women and juveniles, because those were who women were allowed to have as cases, women at that time, and depending on the area, aren't able to work directly with like males in the field. And so she wanted to look at different things, including like, okay, how do we keep juveniles or women from being offenders? This idea has really led to community policing, which is a form of policing that's becoming really popular right now. It's this idea that police can get out into the community, they can be seen, they're members of the community. So when the Sioux City Police Department does things like shop with a cop or coffee with a cop, this is their way of connecting with the community. So it doesn't have to be such like fear mongering when it comes to policing, but that police are there to help you. That's the idea. That's the goal, right? And so that idea really came from really the establishment of women in law enforcement. So historically, even at the police academy, women were not treated as equals. They had lower targets for physical ability and weren't allowed to drive pursuit cars or shoot shotguns. For many departments, women were seen as social workers with badges because of the roles they were assigned. And so even looking at how Alice Stebbins Wells addressed certain policing techniques, it definitely comes off very much like social work. And we have to remember that this is before really the development of a Department of Health and Human Services that looked at the health and safety of children, right? So like a DHS or a CPS, where if kids are in danger, they go in and take the kids out of the home. Those really stemmed from this baseline of community policing and doing more for prevention, not just dealing with crimes after they happen. So during World War I and World War II, women took over some position roles typically occupied by males, such as traffic control. We saw that in essentially every profession in the United States. When men went off to war, League of Their Own is one of my favorite movies where women joined a professional baseball league, right? Like women moved into factories. Same thing happened with the police department, where when there were fewer men to be in those roles, because if we think about what it takes to be a police officer during this time frame, they're typically fit, they're typically within a certain age range, and those were the type of men who went off to war, right? They already have this predisposition for serving their community, serving their country. So a lot of the police officers then went off to the military. So women got promoted to roles such as like traffic control or ones that were less dangerous, but were still seen as predominantly male. Oops. Okay, so looking at women in law enforcement. Then in the 1960s, some women police officers were allowed to work undercover in the vice squad to bust drug dealers and prostitution rings. So working with women offenders, so the idea of prostitution being strictly women offenders, they wanted to have women there to work with the women offenders, but they weren't able to really graduate of what they considered to be like the Women's Bureau, or to become like full patrol officers. If any of you have seen like Captain America or any of those Marvel shows, there's Special Agent Carter, who's a woman, and we started watching it on Netflix. Anyway, it's based in like the 1940s, and it shows a lot how women were treated at the time. Like she was one of the only females in the police department, or in the special agency that they were in. And they treated her as essentially an administrative assistant or a secretary. Like they would give her their lunch orders, even though she didn't ask. She was in charge of making coffee, like all of these secretarial roles, when really she was just as qualified as the men, and she was in the same role as the men, but they didn't want to see her as an equal. They still saw her as weak. They didn't want her to get hurt out in the field. So in 1972, Congress passed an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 which really prohibited state and local agencies from discrimination based on gender. So up until this point, it was essentially legal to be like, okay, women are in these roles, men are in these roles because of like who they are, their body build, things like that. Versus now, it's illegal to be like, hey, just because you're a woman, we're going to put you over here, right? Or just because you're a man, we're going to put you over here. It'll come up later that that's still kind of an issue. But this meant that women in the police force were allowed equal access to jobs, and it really allowed women to move out of some of those desk jobs, out of kind of those administrative roles to becoming like uniformed officers on the street, or even moving into being detectives or working undercover cases without like an all male force to back them up. And then in the 1970s, just 3% of police officers were women. And today that's up to just below 12% nationally. All right, so I see a hand.
Yeah, this is Dagna. I was just going to say that the fact that that passed in 1972, I graduated college in 71, and my girlfriend that I'm still in contact with graduated the same year. And in like maybe 73 or so, she was one of the very first female air marshals. Which is a law enforcement, to go on the planes, that's when there was all the hijackings and things like that. So that's something she's very proud of, that she was one of the very first female air marshals.
Yeah, and that's awesome that she was before they had to, like before they were like, women have to be doing certain things. And so that's awesome. I did not go into like military in terms of women, but one interesting story is like they didn't necessarily consider diversity to be a factor when it came to like fighter pilots, whether it be women or men. And the seats that they had were designed for men of a certain height and weight. And so they didn't realize that a lot of planes were crashing due to the fact that the seats weren't able to move or adjust to different size people in these fighter planes. So granted, a 6'4" man and a 5'4" woman, 1 foot difference. I don't know about you guys, but when I get in the car after my husband's driven, I have to, spend 20 seconds pushing my seat forward so I can even touch the pedals. But that's where that idea of the adjustable seats came from, because they hadn't considered smaller individuals like women in the plan of designing the seats for the planes. So that's just a fun side fact. So like I said, 12% of police officers or law enforcement nationally are women. So that's incredibly low, considering it's about 51% of women, or 50% of people in the United States are women. So this is obviously a very male dominated role. 88%, if my math is correct, 88% of people in law enforcement are men. There's this idea of the good old boys club, where people within the force look out for each other, but also they protect their own. And that can be awesome in times of like support for families. But on the other side, it can create this box that women get put in because they're seen to only be able to take up certain roles. And it's been harder for them to expand outside of that because of this culture of like police departments. So within metropolitan agencies, only 7.3% of top level positions and 9.1% of supervisory roles are filled by women. Women of color make up 1.6% of top level positions and 3.1% of supervisory roles. So let me pop out of this for a second. And I do have the Sioux City organizational chart, because I figure if we're going to do it, we're going to do it, right? Let's see, share our organizational chart. So looking at like in Sioux City, who's in charge, right? So obviously our police chief, Chief Mueller, is male, and predominantly those who are in charge or have their full name listed are the ones who have a little bit more control. But if we look at like administrative assistants, accreditation assistant, admin secretary, those are females. So a predominant amount of those in support roles are female, but not as many who are actually like in the uniformed police officers or under different areas. So they actually do have a picture of our entire Sioux City Police Department. These are the women that we have. So it looks like we have one woman of color. I believe, based on the picture, I'm going to generalize, that we do have a variety of maybe gender identities or sexualities. But as far as visual, we have a lot of white police officers, and that's overall, we have a lot of white police officers. We don't have as much diversity, but even within like those who are females, we don't have that much diversity. And as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3 women who are not in, let's see, 4, 5, 6 who are not in uniform, but then the others are in those uniformed police officer roles. So I know this is Donna. I know she's administrative assistant. Guadalupe is also an assistant. So a lot of women are in those support roles. I was really surprised when I was looking at the pictures that this is what we have for female officers in Sioux City. I, for some reason, was thinking that we had a lot more, but I shouldn't say that I'm surprised, I guess, based on what I know in statistics. And so, okay, back to our little PowerPoint here. I do have a video. This video came out in August of 2020. It is just a short little snippet, maybe like 3 minutes, about the women in blue. And this is specifically looking at Minneapolis, which, as I'm hoping you guys are all aware that right now we have the George Floyd case going on, which, you know, the event that occurred last June. We've had another shooting in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has been kind of a hot spot for race and diversity issues. And so we'll go ahead and watch this. Play from current slide. If you guys can't hear it, let me know. I'm hoping that you can.
The challenge is to treat everyone involved in that call neutrally and not have any predisposed thoughts or predictions.
In her film Women in Blue, Deidre Fishel chronicles some of the challenges female police officers face as they help train fellow officers against excessive use of force in the male-dominated Minneapolis Police Department. Officer Alice White is one of the trainers.
Interact with people who are rapists, murderers. It's sometimes hard to show respect to someone like that. So in my mind, I had to switch this to professionalism. As long as you're being professional, you're gonna look respectful.
The film echoes findings, one as early as the 1970s by the National Police Foundation, that female police officers act less aggressively and believe in using less aggression than their male counterparts.
I just knew that I wanted to make a film exploring what women could bring in a very troubled time that our country has had with police violence.
Hi. Do you know I'm stabbing you? You can calm down. I see you're shaking. Just relax. Relax. It's all good.
You can see in that traffic stop that man that was stopped by Alice had someone who was nurturing and had his well-being at the top and not some law enforcement.
But the film also shows women remaining sidelined, making up only 16% of the Minneapolis Police Department.
The chief has selected no women for his executive team. I have a great deal of respect for Chief Rondo. But the thing that hurt me the most was the fact that in a profession dominated by male voices, they're losing any female perspective.
In Seattle, Police Chief Carmen Best says her department's recruitment ads are designed to attract more women to the force.
We want to show more women. We want to show women in diverse positions. We want to make sure that it's not always car chases and gunfights and repelling off buildings. A lot of what we do has nothing to do with brawn. Has a lot more to do with brain and skill sets and the ability to empathize and to work with people.
It's not just that we need more women, but we need a lot more women of color. I think that's where our police departments could potentially transform.
I got assigned to become a sergeant in the 4th Precinct.
Her film shows only a few African-American female officers like Alice White rising through the ranks.
It's important for the Black community to see women who look like me in this role.
Chief Best relates her own experience rising through the ranks.
Some folks, while super supportive, others were not, maybe, and there was always working through that. My resolve was, that's their problem, not mine. I'm here to do my job. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And I really believe that as you move up, you have to lift up and bring others along with you.
Penelope Pulu, VOA News, Washington.
All right. Okay. So one thing that I thought it was really interesting that they pointed out, which I think is important to point out too, is that the women of color need to be seen, and not just for members of the community who are people of color, but the representation is there. So in order to really help this divide, because there's a lot of race issues, I'm sure you guys are aware, a lot of race issues with the police department and the community. There's this distrust between certain groups and the police department because of whether it's historical issues or how people were raised. We need to have this understanding of how people operate and how their brains work. And so seeing someone who looks like you is huge for a lot of communities to start to build that trust. And so, because it creates this idea where it's not like an us versus them mentality, but that we're all members of a community that we all want to keep safe. And it takes some of those other issues out of it. I could probably, if I wanted to, go into structuring and different things like that within police departments. But one thing that I actually didn't mention on here that I wanted to was that there's been a giant increase with a lot of police departments in diversity training. And so when people hear diversity training, they're like, oh, races, but it's more than just races. When looking at things like sex and gender, looking at, so if we know that a lot of women deal with sexual assault or abuse, domestic violence, being aware as a police officer how you approach that situation. So if there's a woman who's a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, men being aware that their presence, if they're a 6'4" police officer and a man approaching that woman, they may be seen as intimidating rather than comforting. And so typically they will have a woman address another woman when it comes to those crimes, but based on the number of women that force, like the forces usually have, odds are it's not going to be a woman who responds to that call. So for male police officers to be aware of what their presence in certain situations, like how that can impact those that they're trying to help. Because most police, I will say 98% of police officers go into policing because they want to help their community. They want to be helpful. And of course, 2% of every profession are not good people, right? So we'll not count those. But for a lot of people in policing, it's being aware of how you make other people feel. So as we saw in the video, when the officer approached the car, she immediately was like, I see that you're shaking, like, calm down, like, it's okay. And she used I took it to be kind of like a motherly or an empathetic voice instead of a commanding voice. So we do see that men more often will use more of those authoritative voices and skill set rather than that empathetic bonding type mentality. That goes into a lot of socialization and how men and women are raised. What's seen as, assertive or the expected behavior of police officers is typically like masculine, dominant. And so when we get the perspective of women in police departments, we're able to get some of those other skill sets that women are socialized throughout their life to have, to build connections, to talk empathetically. When women talk, they have a tendency to, like, just linguistically, to the end of their sentences kind of curl up. So it seems like they're asking a question, but it's not really a question. what that language is implying is like bringing somebody into the conversation rather than keeping them at arm's length for that discussion, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. But so looking at law enforcement, women were hired as correction officers when there's an increase of neglect and abuse in female inmates by male correctional officers. So historically, whether it was a female prison or a male prison, there were typically male guards. There was a giant issue with the authority figure being male and the inmates being female because it led to this abuse, neglect. This can also be tied into different studies that they've done on power and authority. And so, I mean, like, if you guys are aware, I don't know if you are, I'm sure Bob is, but if you guys are aware of like the Philip Zimbardo study, the Stanford study, where they separated people into groups and some were jailers and some were inmates, and how that power dynamic can impact even the best people. And so they found when they put females in these prison systems with other females, there was less of a chance of this neglect and abuse occurring. But then when women were placed in male facilities, they didn't want the females to have direct contact with the male inmates. They were put in positions like surveillance, so watching the cameras, things like that, or administrative positions, so paperwork. Sometimes they were at the gate where visitors were coming in, things like that. They were checking IDs and things, but they weren't having women be the ones that were like walking around and having direct contact with the inmates in those male facilities. So like I said, women as correctional officers are less likely to be victim. Oh, I didn't say that, but women who are correctional officers are less likely to be victimized by inmates than men. But women are more likely to fear that victimization. So women who are correctional officers are still women in the community, right? So in general, in the community, women fear victimization more than men. And so it makes sense to me that that translates into this profession. I was surprised by the fact that women are less likely to be victimized by inmates. But if we were going to break that down and we were to look at some of the crimes that do occur, they're not necessarily for a reason of, attraction or anything like that. A lot of them are based in power. And so to overpower a male correctional officer would be seen as like an accomplishment, while they would feel overpowering a female correctional officer wouldn't be as big of a deal. Like that's not necessarily an accomplishment. So it's interesting to me that they're less likely to victimize women. So this was not divided by victimization of correctional officers by the gender of the inmate. So I don't know if that means that more women who work in male facilities are not victimized, or women in female facilities, or if more men in female facilities are victimized. Like there wasn't enough data on that to really pull out any solid information. So women are more likely than males to use communication skills rather than physical acts to get inmates to comply. This is where those skills that we learn to talk things out and different things come into play. So women are socialized to have some of those stronger communication skills. You are much less likely to see maybe women getting in a physical fist fight compared to women getting in an argument using communication. So with the goal of de-escalating a situation, meeting that altercation with communication and doing things like bonding or making the inmate feel comfortable, that's gonna result in less confrontation, less conflict than physical acts of getting someone to comply by a chokehold or something like that. Because if we do look at men and women, there are physical differences, right? Like biologically, most men are built bigger and stronger. They can develop more muscle mass than women. But having brute force is not the only way to be a police officer, right? In fact, like the video said, most of the time, it's not those physical altercations that they're working through as police officers. A lot of it is like the communication skills that they use. So in all of law enforcement, women are more likely to use skills that are deemed more feminine by society, including communication skills, care of inmates or citizens. So like we saw in the video where the female officer had that empathetic conversation with the driver. And then mutual respect between law enforcement and citizens or inmates. So instead of trying to establish and maintain an authority position, it's the idea of like, I'm doing my job, you know, you broke the law, this is how we can work this out, where there's less like, I'm in charge, you are the one who did something wrong. Like that mentality is different from men and women. And so, so law enforcement is often seen as masculine in a male-dominated world, like I talked about before. So while there are physical differences between men and women, there are also cognitive differences where women are more effective than men. So based on it's supposed to be study, not student, conducted in Washington, D.C.'s police department, women patrol officers tended to be more effective than their male counterparts in avoiding violence and diffusing potentially violent situations. And then women were less likely than men to engage in serious, unbecoming conduct. And that I can jump down to my male officers cost more with excessive use of force and complaints compared to women. So there's a whole process when an excessive use of force is occurs. So it has to go to certain internal affairs committees. And so a lot of people are involved when complaints like that come in, and it can get expensive based on time and effort, and they have to do some investigating into these. So overall, it costs more to have male officers than female officers in this realm because of how women address situations. So the different language skills that women use compared to men would be like different tone of voice and word choice that can appear more empathetic rather than assertive. I can compare this to the concept of mansplaining. If you guys are aware of what mansplaining is, it's the idea that a woman says something and then a man says exactly what she said, but since he said it, it comes off as more important and more people listen. So that can be broken down into the ways that men and women talk. And so women have a tendency to be less direct when they say things. Like they won't say, this is a problem because. Women are more likely to be like, I see that we might have an issue in terms of how this situation, blah, blah, blah. Right? So the phrasing that's used can come off less assertive. So sometimes men aren't necessarily hearing the same thing. And so men may feel like they're using some of that more empathetic language, but based on the fact that men are taught or socialized to be more direct, it doesn't come off the same way as when women say things. Tone of voice is huge too. I told you guys that I study family, and so there's actually a tone of voice that the primary parent uses when talking to kids. And it's interesting because if you listen to parents, it's typically the mom that has more of the, I don't even know if I can do it now since my kid's not in front of me, but parents have a tendency like to have this type of voice when they're talking to their children, that it's more of that empathetic, nurturing tone of voice versus other studies have shown that when dads, like the disciplinarian, uses their voice, it tends to be more direct, a little bit more harsh. And so the children are more attracted to that primary parent tone of voice rather than the assertive parent tone of voice. And if we just take that and put it into law enforcement, it's that same idea. Yes, Bob's got his hand up. What's up?
I have a question.
Yeah.
This says that women can appear more empathetic rather than assertive. So
Yes.
can appear, but are you actually saying that they are more empathetic?
So that's going to vary person to person. Empathy is obviously internal, to where somebody can act empathetic, but not necessarily be empathetic, right? So women have a tendency to act more empathetic. We don't necessarily know because, I mean, you would have to interview each woman that this occurs with. individually to understand their actual feelings while appearing to be empathetic. So the studies have shown just the appearance. So the researchers took the words and how women said it, but didn't necessarily interview each woman individually. It was the interpretation of their words rather than directly asking them their meaning.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah. So you can fake, you can fake assertive, you can fake all sorts of things, right? And so for some people, if you appear to be empathetic, sometimes that's enough for people. When I did my work with juveniles, whether I compartmentalize, and so I would not take their stuff home with me. I would stick it in a little box in the corner of my brain, right? But that doesn't mean that I wasn't empathetic towards them. And to be empathetic, it's more than just the words that you say, but making that person feel like you care what happens to them, what they say, what they're going through. Rather than having like the assertive viewpoint, which can come off a little bit more cold, which we can see a lot when it comes to some traffic stops or things like that. So I don't know if you guys have been pulled over. I'm going to assume that you guys have been pulled over, where if somebody comes up and is like license and registration, that to me is an assertive, it's an order, I have to follow it. Versus if somebody comes up and is like, do you know why I pulled you over? Blah, 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 and has more of that conversation type discussion rather than orders. I'm going to comply a lot better with the conversation rather than just being told directly what to do. I'm a little defiant sometimes. I try not to be with police officers because obviously that cannot end well sometimes. But in general, people will respond better when engaged a certain way compared to being given orders. And then, so there's one big issue that I want to discuss that women deal with that men don't deal with in law enforcement, and that's going to be pregnancy. So, if you guys weren't aware that men couldn't have babies, I think I addressed that with you before, but hopefully we got that now. But so with the physicality of some police jobs, so if they're uniformed officers and they're out in cars, there's a lot of things that they have to wear, right? Like there's bulletproof vests, there's heavy belts, to where some departments have information about how to handle pregnancy, but some don't. And so let me see, get my stop share here. I have a document from, where is it? It's the policies of one of the police departments talking about short-term. Okay, so Providence Police Department. Let me share this with you. Where's my Zoom at? Okay. So we'll go desktop 2. So this is their policy on light duty. So light duty is essentially if you get disabled or have a short-term disability, pregnancy would be considered a short-term disability. A lot of police departments put the women on light duty after they're not able to fulfill whatever job that they have. So once a woman can't fit in her belt or her uniform, then she gets moved to light duty. So I tried to look up for Sioux City, but their recent policies weren't online, and I would have to contact the police department, and they said that I would have to pay for certain copies. And so I just found somewhere that was similarly sized, a little bit bigger than Sioux City. And so there's the light status, what that entails. So not quite all the duties that they would have in their normal jobs. If they have a doctor's note, saying that they're pregnant or that they have this medical issue, then procedures on how to handle it, like light duty officers can't operate marked police units. A lot of times what this turns into is the light duty will be more administrative type stuff. So I have a friend, she was in corrections in Sarpy County, which is south of Omaha, the Bellevue County. And so she got pregnant when she was working there. And so she was on light duty. And so within the correctional facility, she kind of what I described, what women did in male prisons, that's what her light duty was. So surveillance on cameras, administrative work, when people were checking in and out for visitation, like she would handle a lot of that stuff. So for a lot of departments, there are rules to follow, but there have been a lot of issues recently, I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years, about how pregnancy has been handled. So I have a video. Can you guys still see? Can you guys see the YouTube video? I have it on that screen.
Yep.
So I'm assuming since no one's saying no.
No, you can. We can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I'll full screen that. This is a woman who files a discrimination claim against her police department that she was working for based on how they treated her pregnancy.
Officer and the department she works for are at odds tonight. She wants to stay on the job, but a policy says she discriminates against women, forcing her to take time off, time she's not getting paid for. Now she's fighting that policy. Local 12's Anjanette Levy is in the newsroom with the story. Anjanette?
Well, Rob, this is the 17-page complaint that Officer Lindy Trischler has filed against the city of Florence. She believes the police department had no choice but to follow a policy on light duty that she calls discriminatory. I know, that's an elephant. Lindy Trischler is a devoted mother to 13-month-old Rylan. She also loves her job as a Florence police officer. The work changes every day. You never know what's going to happen. You have a lot of opportunity to help people. Trischler is 7.5 months pregnant with her second child. She says work became difficult when her heavy gun belt crushed her stomach and her bulletproof vest became unwearable. It was really constrictive and I had a really hard time breathing and I started having heart palpitations. Trischler asked to be placed on light duty as she had been during her first pregnancy, but the city informed her its policy on modified assignments had changed. Since her pregnancy wasn't a work-related injury, she'd have to take unpaid time off. I was told that if I had timed it better, that I wouldn't be going through this. That if I had waited and saved up my vacation time and my sick time, that I wouldn't be dealing with this problem, basically. To add insult to injury, Trischler received devastating news about the baby. He just has a disorder that once I'll be able to carry him full term, and then once he's born, he won't be able to survive. Trischler filed a charge of discrimination with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In response, Florence City Attorney Hugh Skees said, "We've seen it. We don't agree with it, but we respect the officer's right to bring it." Meanwhile, Lindy Trischler says she loves her job and her co-workers. She just wants the policy to change. It's a great place to work. But with this policy, I think it makes it difficult for women. Some of Officer Trischler's fellow officers donated some of their vacation time to her so she would be paid for more time off. She is trying to get short-term disability insurance, but will probably have to move because she and her boyfriend won't be able to afford the rent where they are living. Reporting live from the newsroom, Anjanette Levy, Local 12 News. Rob?
Anjanette.
All right. So stop share there. What do you guys think about that? Like, obviously, maternity leave isn't something that men have to deal with, right? There's paternity leave, but it's not like men give birth or have to physically recover from childbirth, right? And so there's a need for different policies. Like, where do you guys stand on this? How do you feel about it?
I think she's going to win the legal action. I don't see how it could be any other way.
Right. I think the fact that they changed it, and I don't know if they didn't send out a memo or something. I mean, you can't just, like, if somebody gets disabled, whether it be, because they rolled their ankle at home or because they got hurt on duty, like, that's still injured and they're still your employee. And so I don't know how they can be like, sorry, you have to stay home for, however long. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the fact that she said they told her that she should have planned better, I thought that was like really, I don't know, that all by itself was a bad thing. And I understand the work related versus non-work related and workman's comp and things like that.
Right.
But I do think that there were things that they could have done to allow her to continue to work.
I think that being with child is a normal human condition.
Yes. Yes.
And you have women of that age working for you, you have to plan for that. It feels like we've turned the clock back at least 50 years. Because I know that I had to deal with some men that were that way. One man just told me that I needed to go home and stay there because I was too ugly to look at. That people shouldn't have to look at pregnant women. Well, so I guess I have a little bit different perspective when I hear her say, this is normal, and everybody, all the other businesses are dealing with it. They are, they have rules and regulations that allow for pregnancy. And I mean, women who are 20, 30 going to have these babies.
Right.
And other people do it, the police can too.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, like I said, I can understand not being able to wear that vest and some of those restrictions. But there's still other things that need to be done.
Yeah, you can't tell me that there's no light duty available. Go ahead, Joyce. Sorry.
I guess I would ask the city attorney if he had a hernia and they told him to go home with no pay, how would that work? How would he feel about that?
Right. I'd be curious, if vasectomies qualify for like a short-term disability, or like, because that's elective. If they timed it better, then maybe if this issue happened to men, like if men were the ones that had babies, like we wouldn't be dealing with these type of issues in society as much, because I mean, to me, the idea that people can be disgusted by pregnancy or think that you're ugly, like, how do you think you got here, sir? Like, like pregnancy is beautiful. Like, hey, sometimes you don't.
He was close to 40. He was close to 40 and still living with his mother.
Oh, well, that explains a lot. And there's more than just, I mean, we could go into that. But
I just want to say, I feel like there's a separate issue where, and this is like opening a small box of worms, but like, I feel like when it comes to pregnancy and women's bodies, people say all the wrong things all the time, constantly. I can't tell you all the things that people said to me, like, and the opinions that were offered. And I don't know what it is about pregnancy, just in general, that makes people think that they can share things or touch your body, or like there's this loss of ownership of yourself that goes with it too. So that's a huge part of it as well.
Yeah, people just reaching out and touching your belly. I was always like stop, like please don't touch me. But we all got here because somebody had a baby, right? And so to me, it's crazy that in society, like, this isn't something that's being addressed. And so the idea that they're not going into addressing this issue within male-dominated fields, to me, it almost seems like they're trying to keep them male-dominated, right? So they're trying to almost discourage women of childbearing age going into these type of positions. Because if I knew that that was a struggle that I was going to go into, I would be like, okay, well, I don't need to work for you, right? Like, or that's not a career path that you choose if you want to have 6 kids or however many. But then, oh, go ahead.
It has always been a power structure. And the men have the power a lot, in many of these areas, and they're not willing to share it. And just to have children, we sacrifice a good chunk of our career because we lose all that time in trying to raise those children. in raising children. It's not just those few months, but many times we take several years off until we feel like those kids are through school and in school, and we can feel that we go back and resume our careers.
Well, this is actually a broader issue than men versus women. If you go into a hospital like I've worked in, you'll find that pharmacists, nurses, doctors, lab technicians, and a lot of other people all compete for the same turf in terms of who is going to counsel patients, who's going to administer medications, and those kind of things. And this is actually a very broad issue where the struggle goes on in a lot of places, and it's a tough issue to resolve, just like this one is.
Yeah. In society, the number of conflicts and power issues, like it's amazing how this all goes through. And I mean, that even leads me in a bit, I'll talk about female lawyers. And so we've heard, did anybody else have any other comments on that before I start going on my other tangent? Joanne, did you want to add something? I saw that you turned your camera on there. I wasn't sure if you just wanted to pop in. All right. So let me pop over. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Here's my PowerPoint. Okay, so we looked at pregnancy, but there's also the side of criminal justice, which is like the lawyers, the judges, and there are also those who like work with victim services or different things like that. So looking at lawyers and judges, while more women are lawyers today than historically have ever been, they only make up 36% of practicing attorneys in the United States. So this is not just criminal law, defense law, like this is all attorneys. And less than 2% make up managing partners of the 200 largest firms, with 21% of women making up partner overall, but they're mainly in smaller firms. So women are partner, but they have a tendency to be partners in smaller firms. So male lawyers make approximately 10% more than their female counterparts, while female partners make about 20% less compared to male partners. So to make partner, like a lot of law firms, you have to put in an incredible amount of time to show your dedication and that you bring in money and to prove that you're eligible, like that you're partner worthy. So on average, it's expected that associates spend 5 to 7 years working about 80 hours a week to demonstrate they should be selected as partner and to prove their worth. So this is harder to do for women who choose to have families due to the primary responsibility of children, which falls on women. So in society, the expectation is that women are you could say, authority figures on children and families. So when looking at what's called the gender gap, gender wage gap, a lot of it plays into, it's more of like a mothering tax.
My apologies.
Oh,
I couldn't hear what you said.
Apparently my watch thinks I was talking to her. I was not. But technology, and I tell you what. But it's this idea that when men and women graduate from law school, they're similar. Their entry level into the legal profession is very similar. It's usually within like 3 or 4%, their pay is. And everything's good when they're working until they decide to have children. So even if the man and the woman decide to have children at the same time, the men are going to be less affected than the women. So if we're looking at things like not only giving birth, right? It's when you're pregnant, the amount of doctor's visits that you have. So you have to take time off for that. Then after you have the baby, I mean, or we can just stick to all the things that suck about pregnancy, right? We could talk about morning sickness not being in the morning, like anytime during the day. There are some days that you feel great. There are some days that you don't. Essentially a third of your pregnancy, so that the first trimester, you just don't feel great, right? Because of hormones and things like that. Your second semester, I'm just going to keep calling them semesters. Your second trimester is usually pretty good. Like your morning sickness has gone away a little bit and you're still little-ish, right? Then your third trimester is just, I don't know about you guys, I gained 50 pounds with my daughter, so I felt massive. Everything from wearing a seatbelt to everything was difficult. I wore slip-on shoes because God forbid that I try to bend down and tie anything. It was, and I was pregnant during the summertime. Don't recommend it. But even like, so there's pregnancy, so there are all these things that you may have to miss because of health issues. Then you have the baby, right? So then you have this other little unit that you've given birth to. Okay. So say you heal fine, that kid's just going to keep growing, you know, God willing, to where if the kid's sick, somebody's got to take a day off and take the kid to the doctor or stay home with the kid. Parent teacher conferences, there's still the expectation that parents be involved in the classroom, right? I myself has been a classroom parent for my older kid for a few years. He's a teenager now. His birthday was yesterday. So we don't have classroom parties anymore. But the expectation was that parents would volunteer to go. Luckily, I had a flexible schedule because that wouldn't have been possible if I had all this other stuff going on, right? And it just goes on. So if your kid's in sporting events, right? Like you can't work 9 to 5 and expect to have your kid at practice at 5, right? Like whether that means someone else has to take your kid or you have to leave early to take your kid. If your kid has games, we were doing that for a while where twice a week our kid had basketball games and 3 times a week he had swim practice, and then every other Saturday he had swim meets. And so when you have kids, like more responsibilities come up surrounding your child. And so it's really difficult. I would imagine it would be almost impossible to be able to work those 80 hours and be able to raise your children how you feel you should, right? Like with women, there's always this pull between work and family because society expects you to be 100% everywhere, right? Society wants us to work like we don't have kids, but they want us to raise our kids like we don't work. And that same pressure isn't put on men. So when looking at these numbers and these expectations for partners or pay, it's going to be different for men and women because of those social expectations for women. I can't even imagine what 80 hours a week would look like. And I have my 13-year-old and I have an 18-month-old. I can't imagine those people who have multiple children who are young being able to put in the time to do this. So men are more often able to do this because if they have a wife at home, she's picking up a lot of that. They call it the second shift, the domestic work. So taking care of the house, taking care of the children. Women on average will put in 9 more hours a week on that domestic work than their male counterpart will. And so throughout the year, that adds up to an extra month that women do of work. But it would be even more in these situations where if my husband worked 80 hours a week and he's working, 12-hour days, that it would be really difficult for him to do anything at home, let alone be around for children, right? And so if they have supportive partners, they're able to do that. And women are more likely to take on some of that work because it's expected of women anyway to do the kind of like domestic spheres taken care of. But it's less likely for men to completely go against like the social norm of taking on the domestic duties. Like it happens, but it's much less likely for men to be like, yeah, I will totally raise our kids alone since you'll never be home and I'll cook all the meals and I'll clean the house. Like that's much less likely to happen. And so it's difficult when it comes to, you should be at work, but you should be at home, and you kind of split these up. When I did my interviews of the women last summer who were in the criminal justice system, I had one of them talk about how difficult it was to maintain a marriage and have children while being a police officer as a woman, because the schedule was so sporadic. So her spouse would work during the day, and then they would only see each other because this woman worked nights. So they would only see each other 2 passing ships, like one was coming home, one was going to work, and clocking in and clocking out of care for the child, right? So it made it difficult. So when they got divorced, it became one of those where they were still friends, which was good. So if one of them, so then this officer was a single parent while being a police officer, which extremely difficult for her because if she got called out for certain issues. So she was one that was in charge of designating protest areas, making sure things were safe. And so last summer, when there was a lot of issues with protests just popping up, she would get called out to address that. And so she would have to call a sitter, family member, her ex-partner to care for their child. And that was just with one child. And so the timing with that was difficult also. And so it's not just lawyers or judges in the criminal justice system. It's also police officers, depending on the duty that they do. So it's less likely for someone in corrections or parole or probation to be called out on an emergency. They're usually with a set schedule unless there's a raid at the jail or something that happens, but they're less likely to get called out or called back into work. So they have more of a predictable schedule compared to if someone is a uniformed officer or someone who goes out into the street. Yeah, so part of that is there's a lot of reasons for the gap, but that's a couple of them. So when looking at the judges, judiciary system, women have started to not necessarily take over, but the representation has increased tremendously over the last several decades. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of the first women to graduate with a law degree. I think she was the first to graduate from Harvard with her law degree. Harvard, Columbia, I can't remember. She switched in the middle there. And I'm amazed that she was able to do it with having young children, right? But if you guys know anything about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her husband, who was also a lawyer, was incredibly supportive, and not just like supportive, but like for the time, almost unheard of how supportive he was of her career. That was like husband goals. I have a great husband who's super supportive of my career, but like for her to be in that position and become as successful as she was, women who get to certain positions, you know that they have to either not have children or have a super supportive partner. So if we look at Madam Vice President that we have, she doesn't have any biological children, she has stepchildren, but she also has a very supportive husband. So she was able to have a very active career as a lawyer because she had that support at home, and she wasn't necessarily torn between being a mother and being a lawyer, because there's some comfort as a stepmom, there's some comfort in knowing that your child has another mom. So it's not just your responsibility to be the mom all the time. So it's okay if you're not there as often as you feel like you should, because there's that extra support. And then, like I said, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her husband being so supportive, and I think they had 2 kids, that they were able to make it work, and he was 100% behind her career. So when we look at like where we have female judges, so most female judges are typically assigned to the general jurisdiction, meaning like the district courts or the trial courts. So in California, 92% of women serve on the trial courts, while the national average is about 84% of women judges serve in the courts at the trial level. I know when working with kids in the juvenile justice system that there's at least 2 or 3 female judges in that area in like the Woodbury County. This is like the 3rd district, I think it is. So this area, there are 3 female judges or magistrates represented in this area at that level in the juvenile area. And because we don't have such big court systems in this area, sometimes they'll serve for both like adult and juvenile. So they're not necessarily in one or the other. So 35.9% of Federal Circuit Court of Appeals judicial positions are held by women. And then 3 of the 9 positions on the Supreme Court are held by women. So I wanted to clarify like how these levels went. So with the federal judicial levels, there's like the district courts or trial courts, which is the bottom rung. Next rung up would be circuit courts, which typically address appeals and things like that. And then if it can't get figured out in circuit courts, it goes up to the Supreme Court. And so I find that very interesting that women are more likely to be on that bottom rung. And I didn't find a whole lot of information in terms of whether that was because they didn't have the same access to higher Supreme Court levels, but my guess would be because they have that maybe a family pull and they're not able to be as career driven. So there are some differences in how male and female judges rule. So female judges impose longer sentences in cases of simple assault. Female judges award significantly higher monetary levels of damages compared to men. So if vandalism occurred and the offending person had to pay for the damages that they did, this in female courts would probably be a higher number than it would for male courts, which I find really interesting. And then in criminal cases, there were similar rulings when comparing men and women they're judging. So I suppose that's nice if you are going to criminal court where you don't have to worry about a male or female judge impacting the decision at all. Okay, so there are some theories of why things are the way they are. So there's the brass ceiling theory, which is similar to the glass ceiling theory. If you guys have heard, the glass ceiling theory is that women can see the top and they can see these upper positions, but they just can't get to them. And it's kind of this idea of like, you would have to shatter that glass ceiling in order to get to those higher positions. But with the brass ceiling, the idea is that they're not able to see people like them in those higher roles. And they're much less likely to have access to them due to the male-dominated field of law enforcement. Then there's the glass cliff theory, because we got glass ceilings, brass ceilings, glass cliffs. The glass cliff is a theory that the risk is higher for women who do manage to make it into those higher ranking positions. So women in those higher positions, there's going to be more scrutiny, more kickback, more negative repercussions if something was to go wrong compared to men. Almost like women are held to a higher standard. So it's a higher risk situation compared to men in the similar positions. Then there's labeling theory. So this looks at like police officers, law enforcement. Labeling theory is the process of defining, identifying, and segregating someone, then making them conscious and self-conscious of their faults or shortcomings. This includes names that women police officers have been referred to, such as badge bunnies or dykes, which can be seen as gender negative terms. So the term dyke is sometimes synonymous with the term lesbian. So this is seen as a woman who's masculine, she's not feminine, she's not womanly, like that negative in that route, versus badge bunny is the other way, where it's like they're just an attractive cop or they're just pretty. So where that, for both of these, there's a lot of physical assessments of these individuals. So they're almost like too ugly or too pretty because there's so much emphasis on how they look and the sexualization of these individuals rather than their performance in that position. So this could also include the idea of women being labeled as like bad mothers if they work too much, or simply to imply that they aren't doing the role society expects of them because they're choosing a dangerous career over their family. And so labeling theory can be applied in a lot of different situations, but like I said, the idea that they're supposed to be raising kids like they don't have a family, but also being a worker, or raising kids like they don't have a job, but being a worker like they don't have a family, where they're supposed to do double the work, to where men aren't considered bad dads if they work a lot, right? Like it's less negative when it comes to men compared to women, who, if they're career driven, then people are like, well, what about your children, right? Don't your children miss you when you're working all these hours? So there's more of that pressure put on women to be good moms. And so, okay, as usual, I like to leave some time if you guys have questions or anything like that, any comments, anything. So Degna's question in terms of, so her question, let me read it to you. I wanted to address that before I get too off topic and start answering other questions. So her question was about what happened in Minneapolis, where the female police officer shot the individual, and she thought that she had her taser in her hand, but she actually had her gun. And in response, she resigned very quickly, almost like she admitted fault, was just like, I'm so sorry, like, my bad, and then she resigned. I think a lot of that has to do with how women respond to situations compared to men. Women have been socialized to be okay with accepting fault, compared to toxic masculinity, which runs rampant in the police departments, unfortunately, where the idea that to admit that you're wrong isn't manly, that you have to be a macho man, that you have to be a certain person and not back down. Like, so the idea that she admitted, like, hey, I made a mistake, and she addressed, she gave herself consequences, rather than in really most police shootings that happen with men, it's more of like, okay, prove that I'm guilty or prove that something's wrong, rather than intrinsically being like, I know I did something wrong and I'm taking a consequence for it. Because right now we're like, the George Floyd trial is going on. And if that were me, I would have been like, I am absolutely guilty, like, save everybody's time. Like, there's video. I would have been a hot mess anyway.
Yes.
But it's men and women do things differently and accept responsibility differently. So I definitely think her behavior has something to do with the fact that she's a woman.
That's kind of what I thought too, because like you said, in almost all these other shooting cases, it's first, it seems to be denial that I did anything wrong. And then it seems like it's almost as they're forced off, like it goes to administrative leave or anything. And it's usually quite a long process before they actually quit or get fired. But this just struck me how she was like, I think it was within 24 hours. It was very, very quick. So I was curious as to if that was a difference, because I don't remember if any of these other shootings that have been in the news, if they were female officers.
Yeah, there was one. The woman, she was a police officer. She claimed that she thought she was in her apartment. She went into her apartment and shot and killed the man. She never admitted she did anything wrong. Never. Even after she was convicted. And she was obviously wrong.
Yeah, that was the one. Was that in Omaha? No.
No.
I can't remember, but she
may
had
have
said
been
that
in Minneapolis. I don't know.
Right? She said that she didn't know the man, but it was actually like an ex-boyfriend of hers. And so for her, my theory on that, my personal opinion would be that she was trying to hide her criminal activity behind her badge.
Yes.
To where it's like, she literally killed an ex-boyfriend or an ex-partner, whatever, and tried to play it off like she didn't do it, she didn't know him, but then picture surfaced of them together, like, you know him. And
I mean, it was obvious that she intended to go, whether she knew him or not, she intended to go in there and kill him.
Right. Yeah. I like, versus a female cop, like, making a mistake and pulling the wrong gun and then taking responsibility for that, versus someone who wasn't going to take responsibility anyway and was just trying to be like, I was doing my job, see? Like, but it wasn't. It was, like you said, Joyce, it was obvious that she was going to, there was a plan for that.
Yes.
Janice, I see your hands raised. Oh, you're muted though. There we go.
Not now. I just wanted to comment that I'm really enjoying what you're saying, but this is not unique to law enforcement. Any profession that is male dominated. I'm a recently retired physician, and when I started, you would not have believed even the questions that were asked. And the issue of pregnancy came up during my interview for med school. Now, I'm one of the fortunate ones. I have 8 children, believe it or not. But my husband, we made the decision, he was a college professor, we made the decision that we were going to have role reversal.
Mhm.
But that being said, I was never in an employed position. So of course, if I have to take off to have babies, of course, if I have to do this, I'm going to make less money
Mhm.
because I'm not, we're eating what we kill. And if we're not killing very much.
Right.
Mhm.
8 kids. I can only imagine. I chase around my 1 toddler and I'm like, I'd like to take a nap. Can you take a nap?
Toddlers are great.
Yeah, they don't, when you're in the middle of it, it seems like it's never going to end, but it's not long before you look around and say, excuse me, who's that running out of the house with my keys?
Well, even now I'm like, where did this baby go? Like,
Yeah.
because she'll sit next to me and now, like over the last couple of months has learned all these words. And I was like, she'll be like, bottle. And then she steals my bottle, like my water bottle. And I'm like, whoa, all right, say please, like slow it down. Like, remember when you couldn't walk and run away from me?
Yeah.
Mara and I were just talking about
Yeah.
kids running away from diaper changes and going to bed. And like, I remember when you couldn't even roll over. Like, that's like with our 13-year-old. Like, don't sass me. Like, someone had to teach you to use the potty. All right. Like, you tone it down over there with your attitude. You don't get to bully us. Like, we keep you alive.
I think that's one of the problems. We say, oh, I'm going to have a baby, but you're not having a baby. You're having a whole person. This is a person that's going to eventually take over the world, help run the world,
Mhm.
and that's really what you're doing. You try not to think of those teenage years, in between there.
Yeah. We get along pretty well with my kid's mom. And so her and I always have the conversation of like, all right, what we're trying to do is not raise an asshole. We're just trying to raise somebody to be a good person. Like, don't destroy the world. Make it better than you found it. Like, if we don't kill you during your teenage years, you're going to be a good person. But that mouth, though, be careful. Like,
So when you were talking earlier about, what was it, Captain America or something? Anyway, it reminded me, there's a series on PBS right now. I think it's like 3rd season or something. It's called Frankie Jake Mysteries or Detective or whatever. And I don't know if anybody else has watched it, but it takes place in the 1920s and up in Canada, Toronto, I think. And but there's a morality officer who works for the police department. And when you were talking about how they were treating somebody in that Captain America, which I've never watched, so I don't know the characters, but it reminded me of how this Mary is being treated in the police department as a morality officer. There's also a woman who works in the morgue, and she's trying to get to medical school. And and her boss is a male, and the issues and everything that she's going through, trying to maintain a job, but also take these classes for medical school and everything. It's if you like detective mystery type things, I mean, it's a fun show. But the characters are really, I don't know how realistic it is for the 1920s, but it's something that it speaks to today.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do we resolve these unfair things?
That is a loaded question.
Well, it's something that we need to address to a much greater extent.
Correct. I think there's 2 directions that we need to go about it. like I said, the police departments aren't big on talking to people on the outside because of that whole good old boys club, we protect our own. So right now, I doubt that a lot of it's going to get solved because they feel under attack in the police departments. And so, and I mean, no one does well when they're feeling attacked, right? Like everyone, you get defensive, you make excuses or try to justify behavior. And so right now, I doubt that they're willing to get any input from anybody. I personally, let me see, 2019, the summer of 2019, I proposed that our police science program at WIT establish a diversity program. And I wrote up like a course plan for that. And then this past summer, they passed it. So we're going to have a diversity program or a diversity course in our police science program. To me, I was surprised it took that long. And when I first proposed it, I was very pregnant and nobody really wanted to listen to me, which I don't know if that was a combination of being a woman and being in a delicate state. And no one wanted to get me all emotionally riled up because, I mean, with those hormones, I would have bitten anybody's head off. So that was not a dragon they wanted to fight. But it just kind of got swept under the rug. Like I sent them all my information. I talked to my supervisor. It was going to go to their advisory council, but nothing came of it until a year later after the George Floyd incident. And then there was a giant push for diversity programs to be implemented at a lot of police departments. So I think that's really the first step, is to start with that education. And there's only so much we can do when people have their minds set and made up. So if we can send new educated people into police departments, that can help change the culture within the department itself. It's going to be a very slow process, but with anything, you know, if it's quick, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work or be the best possible version. And so I would rather it take a while and work than have a bunch of attempts and fail to the point where people are like, well, we're not even going to try it anymore. And so I think when more women become police officers, so in that first video I showed about Minneapolis, the woman from Seattle talked about how their advertising for officers is going to be different, where it's not so much the chase scenes and the gunfights, where they show more of that community policing of interacting with the community. And like we do in Sioux City, like I talked about, like Coffee with a Cop or things like that, to really change how the community sees the police department, how the police department operates from within. So getting more women in there will address more needs for females, because they'll have to figure out a plan. If you have half your force is women, then you're going to have to figure out a plan for women having babies.
I know I tried to get our daughter to apply to the Air Force for pilot training, and that was in probably about 1996, and she didn't do it. But I think those kind of things are another beginning for bringing about changes that we want, or changes I want.
Yeah, you could say we, because I'd like to think that everyone here is on the same page for getting women treated fairly in certain fields.
Yeah, well, but I have to be grown up and own what I say. I have to, I have to take the heat.
You know what? I think that's another thing, is a lot of people aren't willing to take responsibility for what is said or their actions or different things like that. And so that needs to be addressed as well. Janice said, I think belief systems, cultural expectations must change before behaviors will. Absolutely. So addressing even like patriarchal, not to sound like super feminist, but to address patriarchal structures. When I talk to my students, when I teach my diversity classes, I talk about how half the population is women and 25% of the representation in politics is women. And so in an ideal world, we would be represented the same, right? And how people in different positions have different amounts of power, but women, because of the responsibility that they have within the home, like, so if we have more, I think a good place to start would be men stepping up at home so that women have more freedom to achieve more within their degrees or professions. Like in my family, we were raised my mom was in charge. She's about 4'11", but she's the boss. And so I'm a highly educated woman. My husband has no problem picking up the slack or doing most of the stuff. I couldn't tell you the last time I did laundry or cooked a meal. I feed the baby, but that's about it. But he does great work. And then my brother, his wife, is a doctor. And so he's at home with their 2 kids more often than not, because she goes through med school and does all sorts of stuff. And so I think if there were more people like me and my family in this world, right? Not to sound self-centered, but one of those where it's like, if there was more of that equal partnership in a marriage, where the expectation was like, both people are going to raise children, both people are going to care for the house, that would free up like women in general to be able to pursue more avenues that they may want for careers, rather than limiting themselves because of responsibilities. Like they feel like they're going to have, like choosing between being a mom and being a worker, which I feel like happens all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is 2:32.
Ruling. Okay.
So, I was just going to say we probably need to wrap it up, but I'm living and loving this discussion. And Dagna, League of Women Voters, gal right here. So she's all on board for that 50-50.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm sitting here, and Joanne is also League of Women Voters. I'm sitting here because one of the big pushes for League of Women Voters is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm running through my head, oh, maybe Callie could do a program for us.
I would love to. DEI is one of my specializations. So
okay.
I would be all about it.
Yeah. You know, this is also but men, this helps free men too, because they shouldn't have to feel like they're alone out there in the world all by themselves, and all they are at home to their family is a wallet. And because that's not fair to them, you know.
Yeah, like
you're losing half your workforce.
Yeah, like there are a lot of health issues tied to, we can call it toxic masculinity, or the like men feeling like they need to be breadwinners. And it was funny because I just talked about this yesterday to my class, and I was like, how many of you would be okay with being a stay-at-home dad? And all of them were like, we'd love to be stay-at-home dads if our wives made money. I was like, my heart's all squishy. Like, look at you guys being ready to be the next generation of dads and husbands out there.
Yeah, that was one of the issues when I was younger. Are you as a man, you know, we talked about, are you as a man unhappy, you're uncomfortable with the idea that your wife might be making more money than you? And our son-in-law sits around and say, hey, Elaine, go make more money than me. I'm all right with that. I'll stay home, watch this kid.
That's where my husband's at. He's like, you mean we're going to have more money and I don't have to do any more work? He's like, go for it. I'm like, that's a partnership. Exactly. Like, thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of my class.
I want to say Sandy put in the comments that she wishes her internet connection would have been better. She has a tough one because she lives out in the boonies. But she would love to chat with you about juvenile justice, and she worked at a detention center classroom for almost 30 years. And she says, so interesting. Thank you.
Yes, you can always email me to Sandy or email Mara and she can send it to me.
Yep.
Yeah, we can definitely chat about that.
And then of course, Callie a little bit later on has the deviance class coming up too. So we can all continue this conversation in a little more deviant way pretty soon. So, Callie, a wonderful job, incredible information, and thank you everybody for being open to learning about this and creating such good conversation too. So have a wonderful day, and like I said, get ready for a little deviance. Let me know if you want to get enrolled. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Kelly. Thanks, Mara.
Bye-bye.